There are places on a map where the silence feels like a thing with its own weight. Not the kind of quiet that comes from snow falling or wind slowing, but a quiet that swallows ordinary noises and leaves a room full of echo. I first learned that during a night shift in a tiny, unheated movie house where the projector's hum was the loudest voice in the whole town, and where something unlabeled and old changed what I thought about the word remote. It was the kind of theatre that only exists because people make it exist. A single screen, folding chairs, a concession counter that owed more to hope than to profit. The building sagged a little in the middle, like it was trying to listen. Winters pushed at it with a force that made the light bulbs complain. Regulars came for movies and a place to be together, and everyone pitched in to keep it running. Someone fixed the generator, someone swept the floors, someone, once in a while, ran the projector. For a while, that someone was me. I liked working nights. No small talk, steady mechanical rhythm, the kindly solitude of celluloid and reels. The projector room had the best seat in the house, a narrow window that looked down at the empty rows like an altar. The room smelled like spliced emulsion and oil, like the kind of nostalgia that had been left out in the cold too long. I knew every click and sigh of that old machine. It was a companion that did not ask questions. The can arrived late. No note, no name, just a small scuffed metal cylinder wedged under the lip of the projection booth door. It shouldn't have been there. Someone could have put it in at closing, a prank, a wrong delivery, but in a place where nothing happens quickly, an object like that could fester. I remember the weight of it in my hands, warm from the day, like it had been carried by someone who didn't want to be seen. I ran the film because that's what you do. You tell stories for people. You spool the past and hope it fits the present. We had a weekend of older films to screen, so the projector was already half awake. I threaded the celluloid and fed it through, watched the sprockets take hold, and let the first frames unspool onto the white. At first it looked like grain and shadow, the way old film breathes when it's been rolled up for decades. Then figures, shapes around a fire, men moving slowly, hands that seemed ritual in their slowness. The image was silent, warped at the edges. My first thought was home movie, someone's wedding, someone's hunt, but the camera angle was too deliberate, too composed, and the men wore masks. They were naked beneath the masks. They carried torches that ate the night. Pines hemmed the scene in. White spruce, I remember thinking, my mind flipping to tree identification, because it's what you do when you try to anchor an image that shouldn't be happening in your projection booth. A figure was tied to a tree, slumped, a dark shape that the film didn't want to make clear. The masked men circled step by slow step, the light from the torches catching on the masks, so the faces became plates of bone. It was not a celebration. It was something else, choreographed, almost reverent in a way that made it colder, not warmer. I flicked the switch. The projector coughed and died. 1 second the theater was a small planet of light, and the next, it was only me and the machines breathing. Air moved differently in that room after seeing those frames. The last image before the reel clicked to an unspooling pause had the camera go in close on an object, on an edge of clothing, a piece of rope, a glint of something metal. And then the film shuddered in a way that meant it had been cut, spliced, or simply run its true course. I set the can down like it had burned me. Why would anyone leave something like that in a projection booth in a village that knew where everybody's business started and ended? Why would something with no label be dropped where people came to watch comedies and westerns? Those questions were the beginning, and they hardly hinted at where it led. I told Pete, our VPSO, because in a place that small you tell someone. Pete took one look and said, with a face that told me he already regretted hearing the words, "You turned it over to the troopers." That was the proper thing, the step not to skip. Trooper Sheldon Yazzie came down from town in a truck that had the sort of faded authority only a state vehicle can show after decades at the edges. Yazzie handled the film like it was a relic, carefully with latex gloves and the respectful distance of someone familiar with odd things people found in the woods. He told me, not unkindly, that the stock looked older. Probably mid-1970s, he said, based on sprocket marks and the way the emulsion had cracked. He said Alaska had a lot of those old reels drift into circulation, town events recorded on celluloid, hunting footage, kids playing. The archive of a life on fragile nitrate film. He also said something else, in a voice that shut down the little theater inside me. It was shot in a place that felt like the interior. Spruces, low scrub, the kind of terrain you don't get south of the range. It could have been filmed here, or 30 miles from here, or across the state. He couldn't tie it to any missing person report or known local tragedy. The images were old, they were suspicious, and they did not sit neatly in any available case file. The investigation stalled in a way that frustrated the sensible part of me and opened the irrational place where obsession grows. Troopers have resources, but they also have jurisdictional limits. No prints, no obvious faces, no identifiable marks to run against databases. The film was physical evidence, yes, but it was also a private thing that had been left to the public by whatever hands had put it there. Yazzie said the lab would try to enlarge and clean frames to pull any detail they could. But there are limits to what old damaged nitrate gives up. I started looking on my own. It began with the kind of harmless rummaging you do when you're trying to make sense of something. Asking around at the community hall, stopping by where old folks sat to sip coffee and recollect, scanning for rumors like a cheap radio picking up static. Word travels in small towns, but it travels in different registers. Some things get filtered and refiltered, details thinned into punchlines or warnings. I found someone who remembered a traveling group that had passed through in the 70s, an itinerant troupe of sorts, but names were fuzzy, faces even fuzzier. A woman at the co-op mentioned a man who used to shoot odd films for reasons no one understood. Another old-timer waved the whole thing away as young folks' antics, but you can tell when someone is being coy about something important, and coyness is often a small town's way of protecting itself from stories that don't fit a tidy moral. The can opened more doors than it closed, and the doors were mostly in Fairbanks. There is a junk shop there that is a museum of things people bring to forget. Lamps with the bulbs missing, trunks full of letters in a language no one else speaks, and film cans. It sits on a side street where the wind has learned to keep to itself, and the owner has a practice of cataloguing the provenance of its treasures with a bartender's memory. He let me rifle through boxes of unlabeled reels and watched my expression as if weighing a bet. He could not tell me where the can I found had come from, only that reels did circulate through his shop in waves, sold by estate sales, left under restaurant counters, dropped off by people who found them and didn't know what to do. I sent duplicates of the frames to a lab. I watched as technicians, efficient and respectful, tried to coax signals from the grain. Sometimes film will give you a watermark, a manufacturer's stamp, a notation in the leader that tells you who processed it. This film had none of that. There were, however, small quirks, a propensity for banding in the lower right of the frame, a chance of soot on the emulsion as if the reels had been stored near a fireplace, an odd scratch that looked handmade. The lab sent a report back to the troopers, and to me with tentative dates and a cautionary note about drawing conclusions. Could this be staged? Some asked. It's a practical question, one that professionals throw into the ring before accepting the more sinister interpretations. Staged for what? A hoax, a film project, a local ritual reenactment? Trooper Yazzie considered all of it. He told me people produce strange media for reasons that are often more human than monstrous. Drunkenness, bravado, art gone wrong. The troopers tested what they could, a few finger swipes, comparison with known footage, inquiries with regional historical societies. Nothing fit cleanly. I watched the film again, in my apartment this time, because the projection room kept the theater's inertia with it, and I needed the cold distance of my own place to think. I rewound frames and froze them on faces that the camera had chosen not to explain. There was an elegance to the composition. Someone who knew how to frame a shot had shot it. That made it harder to dismiss as random. The masks were too symmetrical, the movements too precise. It suggested intent, and intent implies people behind it who wanted whatever they were doing to be recorded. After the second viewing, I stopped sleeping well. It is a small thing to admit, but not sleeping is how a curiosity mutates into obsession. I started cataloguing the reels I found in my head, where they might have come from, who might have cut them, what story the men in masks were telling to one another in that ring of torchlight. I would get up in the middle of the night and flip through photo archives of those years, anything to find a face or a prop that matched. Weeks stretched, Months slid. I became the kind of person who sees a pattern where there might not be one. One more turned up in an old storage locker auction I bid on awkwardly online. It wasn't the same footage, but it had the same sensibility. Anonymous camera work, slow ceremonial movements, nature used as a stage. The second reel didn't give me answers. It broadened the problem. These weren't likely one-off home movie pranks. They were echoes, pieces of something that had been filmed more than once, by someone who cared to record what they were doing. People around town noticed the change in me. "You're turning this into a hobby," someone said kindly. A friend said, "It's like you're trying to solve a puzzle no one asked you to fix." There was truth in both statements, also danger. Obsession isolates. It creates a new geography inside the mind, where everything bends toward a single unsolved shape. I kept going because the idea of leaving those reels in shelves or thrift bins felt like losing a witness. At one point I drove with the film to a university archive 3 towns over. A professor who specialized in historical film preservation examined frames under a lamp, her gloved fingers an inch from the edges, as if they might burn. She said the masks looked like they were handmade from leather, perhaps cut to mimic faces. She pointed out seasonal cues, the way the trees leaned, the length of shadows, things that suggested a winter that wasn't necessarily deep Arctic, but cold enough to make sense if you were filming through the shoulder seasons. She did not, however, find a studio stamp or a maker's mark. Trooper Yazzie sent me updates when there were updates, and often there were few. There was an instance when a cousin of a man who had lived in a settlement outside Nome thought he recognized a landscape in a frame. But by the time troopers went to speak to that man, he had passed and the trail grew colder. Old cases have the unfortunate habit of being claimed by time. It eats context. People die, memories misplace themselves, and the physical evidence grows thinner as film grain degrades. I began mistakenly to think the reels were speaking to me because I had reframed my life to listen for them. I checked my calendar less often. I took shifts that kept me nights and fed me excuses for being in the booth alone. I started keeping boxes of duplicates in my apartment, like specimens under glass. They were harmless until they weren't. There was a night when I almost followed a hunch into the woods. I had a frame frozen in my head that suggested a small clearing with a low rise where the camera might have been placed. I drove out of town under a starless sky, the can hot in my truck seat. I told myself I would look for anything, an old burn scar, remnants of wood, enough to get experts curious. I turned off the engine a mile out when the road narrowed to a track and the wind started to speak in human consonants. Alone in the dark, I realized how foolish it would be to go trolling for ghosts with a single frame and a head full of assumptions. I turned back. The notion of trespassing into a living landscape to validate an image felt wrong. It was then I understood that some secrets you can chase only to the brink of your own safety, and chasing them further would be self-indulgence or worse. The obsession showed its cost slowly. I lost shifts, and not in a dramatic way, just enough that the board of volunteers raised an eyebrow. I lost sleep. I gained the habit of returning to the projection room before dawn, just to sit where those masked men had competed with dim bulblight for my attention. The theatre was a warm place to be alone with questions that had no answers, and with film that gave up only what it wanted. At the time, I thought leaving town would be a surrender. Later I understood it was the only honest choice left. Did the reels show a cult? A reenactment? Some community's odd ritual? I refused to call those men part of a named conspiracy. Trooper Yazzie and other troopers called the footage disturbing and unexplained. Both careful words, both true. Some in town thought it grotesque performance art from a bygone era. Others, quieter, said they feared it might connect to missing people from decades ago. All of that sits under a layer of uncertainty. You put a label on something too soon, and you close one possible truth while you might still be standing in the presence of another. The last thing I did in that town was hand a final box of reels to a small archive 3 airports away, with instructions that they be catalogued and kept where researchers might find them if anyone else decided to follow their trails. I left a note for Trooper Yazzie with my number, though I never heard back in the way you'd expect. I left because obsession had turned me brittle. What once was curiosity had become a place I couldn't rest. People asked me later whether I regretted leaving. I said no, and I meant it because safety is not a regret. But I also carry a residue of that theater night with me, a memory you can't file away. There are frames that visit in the middle of the night, and sometimes when I stand in new airport lounges and watch strangers in their jackets and mufflers, I find myself trying to guess which of them might have spent an evening in the woods with a camera. It's nothing rational. It's the way the reel rewired the way I see strangers. If this sounds like the setup for a true crime frenzy, understand this. The reels are evidence of something, but they are not evidence of everything. They hint at human cruelties, but they do not map them. They are as much a testimony to our inability to account for our past as they are to anything definitive. The troopers did what they could. The archivists catalogued and stored. The junk shop owner shrugged and kept his ledger. The film sits now in a place where scholars and investigators can look at it without being the only people in the dark. But the images still leak out into the world like a faint, persistent rumor. If you've stayed with this so far, if the thrum of curiosity in you has matched the one I felt the first night I threaded that film, then consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There are more cases like this, and sometimes the only thing that keeps a cold file from staying cold is a few extra eyes. I'm not asking you to become a detective. I'm asking you to witness, the way we witnessed in that old theater. Without flourish, without recklessness, and with the respect the people and places behind the images deserve. They say pilots talk about odd things in clouds the way sailors talk about shoals, tactically, and with contempt you only show for the sea that will kill you if you let your guard down. After I left the theater, I drifted into a different kind of small world solitude, flying. It's not that I wanted to run from those frames, but sometimes machines that operate with clear, measurable rules are the balm for a mind that has been pulled by superstition. A plane responds to input. Clouds obey certain physics. Engines have symphonies of sound that engineers can read. Up high for a while the world is just wind and altitude, and a horizon that asks simple questions. I flew freight and people across the state in a little plane that had undoubtedly seen better paint jobs. My passengers were the kind you meet in bush strips, hunters, elders, the occasional journalist who wanted a weather-beaten story. I loved the work because it was straightforward. You pre-flight, you check the carb heat, you watch the fuel, you listen to the engine's temper. Alaska teaches respect for a checklist. The land will remind you of it in ways you don't want on a bad day. One autumn run started normally. I had a load of supplies headed to a village that sits where the map looks less like a neat line and more like a scatter of dots. The weather brief had been reasonable enough. There were grey sheets on the forecast, the kind pilots curse but accept. The first hour of flight was a patchwork of tundra and river, the kind of view that hushes people into a respectful silence. Clouds drew like thumbprints across the sky, heavy and indifferent. I remember thinking briefly and with a pilot's usual arrogance that these were the clouds we knew how to read. We had instruments for a reason. The compass is a stubborn animal. My panel was patched with instruments I trusted, and yet some things happen that instruments do not explain, and that pilots will tell you about in half-jokes after a beer. There is a fraternity of near misses and hand-wringing over phenomena that make you check your harness before you sleep. You learn the language of those moments. The airplane didn't want to fly. It felt like someone else was touching the yoke. The world moved in the wrong direction. On that flight, about 40 minutes out, the engine made a noise it had never made before. It wasn't a large mechanical collapse. It was a cough and a small, low vibration like a throat clearing. Carburetor ice is a nasty, familiar ghost in those parts, but the temperature seemed wrong for it. My instruments didn't agree with any single diagnosis. The tachometer dipped, the oil pressure blinked, then steadied. The nose started to chatter with a vibration that didn't feel structural and made the hands on the yoke feel remote, as if there was latency in the machine's response. My training kicked in. I trimmed, I reduced power, I checked mixture, I cycled the mags. The plane for a long minute felt like a temperamental animal that might decide the rules of engagement at will. The clouds were thickening. Visibility collapsed to a whiteness that made even the instruments seem like clumsy interpretative tools. Pilots talk about spatial disorientation, the sensation that the horizon is not where it should be. It's a physiological betrayal. Without visual cues, the body lies and your inner ear maps an imagined horizon. I felt the plane roll a degree in a direction I hadn't ordered. My hands, practiced steady, pulled back on controls, and the response was slow enough that you noticed the universe recalibrating its promises. There was a moment when the engine cleared itself and then stuttered again. It's the kind of thing that will make you think of your family, of 100 small things you've put off. As a pilot, you try, when you can, not to gift the sky your private catastrophes. The checklist is not therapy. The checklist is a tool. I went through it, and all the while a part of me that had sat in a cold projection booth months earlier watched the sky like a film I'd paused on a frame that suggested something else. That some places hold anomalies you are not meant to witness without consequence. When we finally broke out of the cloud layer, the world was brighter and crisply ordinary in the way that terrifies you. Everything works again, but you have the knowledge of what it did, and you cannot unknow it. An engine that dies in a cloud and restarts when exposed to sunlight is not a story you tuck away easily. Mechanic talk at the airfield was the sort of practical exorcism pilots use. Could have been a carb issue, maybe a small bird. Wiring tends to act up if it has a nest. Some of the tales I heard from seasoned bush mechanics were less tidy. Pilots telling of lights in cloud banks, instruments that looped and lied, whole planes returning with sand or oil where no sand should have been. Pilots talk about this with a mixture of fear and disbelief, one mechanic told me, and I understood what he meant. There is a history of things in the sky that look like nothing any manual would ever predict. Sometimes you can point to a cause, sometimes you cannot. The state troopers will not form a hypothesis about a system you could have fixed with a screwdriver, but in the bar later, over a coffee gone cold, pilots will swap stories that sound like folklore until you realize the stories are all that remain of near tragedies. That flight stayed with me the way the reel did, different in texture but similar in effect. Both scenes undermined the neat assumption that the world will behave as promised. In the projection room, the images suggested human darkness hidden in trees. In the sky, the clouds suggested a physics that could be peculiarly local, uncooperative and dangerous. In both, the environment magnified the uncertainty. The geographic isolation made everything more consequential. If something untoward happens in the middle of a prairie, neighbors hear it. If it happens in the middle of a cloud or a spruce, there are fewer witnesses and fewer rules for what to do next. I kept flying because it kept me honest. Instruments remind you of cause and effect in a way reels never do. Still, I collected stories from other pilots the way I had collected reels, small private testimonies to the way the land and sky conspire with human vulnerability. I would trade my own near miss for a mechanic's theory, a pilot's half-laughed anecdote, a local elder's quiet observation about weather changes over the years. Each added a note to an ugly chord. It is odd to say you're haunted by mechanics' gossip, but that is the neatness of living at the edges. The human mind will make ghosts of the things it cannot explain. As I flew, a thread began to pull taut in my chest, a conviction that Alaska isn't haunted in the way stories make it out to be, full of spirits and malice, but haunted in the sense that its scale and indifference make small human horrors and strange phenomena loom larger. A bad choice is more dangerous here. An engine misbehaving is rarely a small problem. A missing person is more likely to vanish into geography that doesn't much care to be found. Just as I began to feel comfortable in that sky, proudly alive with controlled risk, I took a run that started at dawn. The clouds had a low, theatrical presence, like a curtain preparing for a play. The weather briefing had been lukewarm. We made the usual pre-flight checks, blessed the propeller in a private, superstitious way that most bush pilots keep, and took to the air with our cargo strapped in. The first 30 minutes went as routine as the hum of a fridge. Then the world tightened in the way that makes all lines of certainty bend. The wind changed at once, or so it felt. Instruments grew fretful in a harmonics I couldn't explain. The radio carried the dry, thin voice of another pilot, saying something that meant nothing and everything at once. "Watch your 6, there's a shelf forming." I banked, and for a heartbeat, the plane sang a note of resistance that was not purely mechanical. Perspiration crawled along my back despite the cold. The cloud bank opened its throat and swallowed us. I will leave how that flight ends for later, because it is where technical explanations begin to blur into pilot's folklore, and because some things should be set against a sky you don't yet trust. It's the sort of story where the procedure manuals and the late-night tavern confessions meet and disagree with one another, and where, as in that projection booth, the truth is a small, stubborn thing hidden under layers that refuse to yield. The mountains below us were anonymous shapes, the tundra a muted map. Inside the cockpit there was the intimacy of two people and a machine, or sometimes only you and the seat when you fly alone. You learn the soundtrack of survival, the engine, the slipstream, the small, urgent squeaks, and then silence when something goes wrong. That silence takes on character in places with room to echo. Clouds can be cruel, but they are also only clouds, or so the manuals insist. Yet when the instruments began to argue with one another and the plane shuddered in a manner that didn't fit standard failure modes, it felt as though the sky itself had decided to test its authority. A pilot learns to trust the rules until they do not apply. And when they don't, you find yourself asking different questions. Are you facing a weather event beyond the known, or is there some other explanation that only your particular corner of the state can provide? The answer matters less in the moment than the knowledge that the ordinary can become extraordinary with the blink of a cloud. What follows is a story bequeathed to me by a flight I'd rather forget, by the mechanics who patched us up, and by the other pilots who swapped their versions like cards. It is the kind of story you pass to the next new pilot as a cautionary tale, the sort you tell over stale coffee to keep the edges of fear practical. But like the reels, like the missing man in the months to come, it resists neat conclusions. It sits instead as a question you carry. When the sky swallowed us, it did so like a living thing, slow, patient, and with a kind of bureaucratic indifference. For a while, in that white soup, the airplane was less a machine than a small island of meaning suspended in a blank sea. My hands had a job to do. The rest of me watched the world compress into checklists and rehearsed motion. I went through them, out loud, where sound helped my brain keep time. Mixture, lean, carb heat, on, pump, cycle. Each step was a way of refusing panic, the right to rename the moment. The vibration increased. It was the sort you notice in your teeth before you notice it in your hands, a low, allergic tremor that suggested something vibrating at the edge of the airframe rather than inside it. The tack dipped again, and the oil light flirted with the panel, then winked off as if embarrassed by its own theatrics. The radio crackled with nothing useful. The other pilot's voice had drifted away like a ghost ship's call. Without horizon cues, the inner ear becomes a treacherous storyteller. I felt the plane roll a degree to the left, and my hands answered before reason agreed. I told myself what pilots tell themselves in those hours: fly the airplane first, think later. Then, with the weird conviction of events that refuse to be mundane, the cockpit went quiet. Not the comforting quiet of a mission accomplished, but the shard quiet of something missing. The engine's hum thinned to the sound of a distant refrigerator motor. For the space of a breath, the airplane seemed to be considering options. Somewhere behind my eyes, a repository of small pilot prayers went unused. When the engine stumbled, a map of possibilities unrolled in a way that felt clinical and private. Carb icing, fuel contamination, magneto trouble, foreign object damage. These are diagnoses the practical mind runs through like a doctor testing reflexes. I worked as if reciting a poem I've learned by rote: pumps, tanks, mags, mixture. Some part of me expected the instruments to produce a smoking gun. They offered instead a chorus of polite confusion. The gauges didn't agree. The electrical system behaved as if there were a delay between idea and motion. The airplane shivered like an animal, caught between startle and relief. Then, almost absurdly, the noise returned. Smooth, steady, ordinary, as if whatever had stolen the engine's breath had decided to give it back when it had had its fill. We broke through the bottom of the layer a few minutes later into an ordinary, sun-scrubbed sky. The tundra opened up beneath us like a stitched quilt. The airplane wanted to be a machine again. I was left with the slow terror of someone who had looked a toothless void in the eye and not had a story to tell afterward, only a checklist to tidy things up. On the ground, the mechanic's face was a ledger of professional curiosity and caution. He listened to my description, nodded, and then said, with a kind of pilot's gallows humor I came to accept as protocol, "You're not the first person to land here and say the sky sang to them. He ran the engine through its paces, looked for obvious signs, loose wiring, animal nests in exhaust stacks, moisture where it shouldn't be, and found nothing conclusive. He washed his hands of supernatural explanations, the way anyone with grease under their nails washes off oil, politely but without conviction. Stories accrued after that in the way moths gather around a porch light. Other pilots shared their own small miracles and miseries. A flight that came back with sand powdering the cockpit where no sand should have been. A set of instruments that looped a reading at 10-degree bank for minutes before snapping back. A friend who saw a set of lights that moved with impossible coordination inside a cloud bank. Mechanics who prefer parts and torque offered rational theories. Moisture in fuel lines, transient electrical oddities, rare magnetic anomalies, but their rationality always arrived with the caveat that weather sometimes produces behaviors that manuals don't account for. We traded these stories in small practical doses, over coffee at the airstrip shack, on the steps of the hangar when the wind didn't make conversation easy. They functioned both as data and as ritual, by naming what had happened, by folding the shock into ordinary speech. We performed a kind of communal triage. Pilots have their faiths, in checklists, in pre-flight rituals, in each other's tales that warn and instruct. Folklore among flyers is not necessarily irrational. It's a map of what to suspect when instruments lie. Still, the way our tales clustered around the cloud episode made the sky feel like a room that had developed a bad habit. It was a small thing, but the kind of detail that accumulates into unease. When people asked me later whether I was afraid to fly after that day, I had a hard time answering honestly. The kind of work that keeps you alive on a thin margin also teaches a respect that passes through fear into competence. Fear can be useful if it sharpens your attention. It can be crippling if it becomes a story you tell yourself instead of a condition you manage. The difference, I learned, is the difference between living with a tool and worshipping the thing that might fail you. But every so often, after a run when the clouds looked too suggestive or a mechanic raised an eyebrow at odd deposits on a cowl, the story would return like static. I would remember the theatre with its single bulb and the way that black and white image had hung in my mind. Both episodes, the real and the cloud, made a similar move. They took a place I thought I understood and suggested an alternative geometry, something hidden among spruce, something that bends the rules you thought were fixed, a gap where facts and fear meet. In Alaska, those gaps can stay open for a long time because the land is patient and no one else is close enough to close them for you. If aviation has its own set of myths, the villages have theirs. Those are the stories that people tell not to frighten outsiders, but to maintain a cultural margin of safety, pragmatic lessons wrapped in narrative. None of the stories from Point Hope came to me as myths at the start. They arrived as the grief and confusion of people who had lost one of their own in the kind of place where loss is amplified by geography. Point Hope sits where the map looks like a hesitant dot, a place where the coastline pushes out like a knuckle and the sea breathes in close. The nights there can be a long, quiet wait. In winter, the dark rules, and in the shadow of that long night, people live with a different sense of time. That context matters because it makes every disappearance more consequential and every search more urgent. The difference between a person missing and a person becoming an absence that reshapes a community's sense of what is possible. Uncle Kimmick was a man you could recognize in a crowd by the way the dogs moved around him. Not a flashy musher, the kind outsiders imagine with parades of medals, but a practical old man whose relationship with his dogs was the kind steadiness of mutual work. He knew the land like a reader knows a favorite book. Not every page, but enough of the weather, the ice, the old wind-gnarled landmarks to find a way across. He kept to himself in a way elders often do. Generous with advice, brief with stories, quick with a smile that suggested there were things he didn't need to explain. The night he failed to return started like nights often do, an ordinary departure that becomes the last ordinary thing. He left town with supplies and a plan, the kind of trip someone like him could do with their eyes half closed. The sky was strange that night, locals said afterward, an isolated bank of lightning that didn't come with thunder the way a summer storm does. It wasn't the kind of rolling thunderstorm you can hear coming. It was a localized brightening phenomenon that lit the horizon in a staccato flute of white. People noticed it from their windows, and made note in the way people mark weather, casually, with a sense that the landscape had merely done one of the things landscapes do. When the hours passed and he did not return, a search began the way these searches do in small communities. Fast, fierce, intimate. Volunteers gathered, elders organized nodes of radio communication, and someone called troopers to coordinate what they could. Volunteers knew the tundra like a palm. They read tracks, they knew which drifts ate flesh and which ridges offered shelter. They went out in snowmobiles, on foot, through hours that only the polar regions hold, the hours that eat brightness and leave a sense of time dislocated. What they found was a scene that, in its details, resisted easy explanation. The sled was smashed nearby, wood splintered and buckled in a way that suggested a sudden, violent force. Yet there were no large animal tracks leading away in the snow, no scrape marks that clearly belonged to a bear, no sign of a struggle in the way you'd expect one. Clothing found in the snow was shredded in places and scorched in others, as if by different forces acting together. His body was discovered not long after by a searcher who described its condition with the kind of clinical restraint volunteers learn to adopt. Badly damaged, he said, the words both blunt and reverent. They called troopers, who photographed and took statements. The dogs were gone. No harness, no paw prints leading to a known place, no sign of a frantic trail. They were simply absent. The troopers conducted what investigation they could, but the first problem was obvious. This was not a suburban case where cameras and witnesses multiply overnight. This was tundra and night. Evidence is thin in such places. An item can be obscured by drifting snow overnight, a scent trail erased by wind, a track confused by the particular way ice forms. The searchers did what they could, canvassing with volunteers, reviewing the environmental cues, collecting what could be collected. In the end, troopers and volunteers convened and shared the same hard, unhelpful observation. There was no single narrative that fit all the evidence neatly. Locals offered explanations, and they did so with the mix of practical wisdom and cultural memory that small communities rely on. Some insisted it must have been a natural predator, that maybe the dogs had panicked and fled, that an opportunistic bear or a hungry pack moved faster than a man could react. Bears, after all, do attack with a brutal efficiency that is ugly but explainable. Others pointed to the lightning. An odd localized electrical storm could have incapacitated both man and dogs in rare, violent ways. Others still, quieter, said that the way his clothing was scorched in places suggested an electrical phenomenon or an explosion of a pocket of methane common in certain thawing tundra spots. A few who carried more of the old stories in their bones mentioned things the elders call by names that translate awkwardly. Not accusations, but reminders that the landscape is held by histories beyond a single lifetime, stories that offer caution by personifying the numinous. I was careful to note how people spoke of the unknown. Point Hope elders did not invent reasons to scare children. They offered narratives with practical advice sewn in. When an elder mentions a sea spirit or a cautionary tale, in small Arctic communities, it's often shorthand for a set of observations about ice currents or weather shifts that have killed before. It's both culture and survival manual. I mention that because I watch the way outsiders sometimes take folklore and make it into something else. Colorful, accusatory, exotic. That is not what I saw in Point Hope. I saw grief, the sober work of searching, and the slow adoption of a story that helps people live with an unresolvable loss. As days became weeks, the absence of the dogs became a central ache. To lose a musher is one thing. To lose the dogs that are both family and equipment in one act leaves the community with the sense that something efficient removed them, something that could carry away a pack with purpose. People organized continued searches. They spoke the way small villages do, quiet and routine, because loud grief attracts itself less helpfully. The village council convened with troopers. There were suggestions sent outward to regional agencies. Someone from a university with an interest in permafrost phenomena asked to be included in reports, citing odd lightning events associated with certain thaw cycles. But such theories required data that the region simply did not have in the moment. Theories multiplied, but the case remained stubbornly inconclusive. Bears account for some missing persons. Accidents account for others. Then there are things statistics can't easily touch. Rare electrical events, a combination of weather and geography, or something as simple and messy as a sled tipping in the dark and snow hiding the rest. People in Point Hope wanted, above all, to understand so they could feel safer. The uncertainty refused them that comfort. What I noticed most was how the community adapted the absence into their rhythms. There were practical shifts. Old routes used less at night, extra pairs of eyes on packing lists, an increase in co-traveling among those who used to go alone. There were ritual shifts, gatherings where people shared stories and remembered practical decisions that would make future trips safer. Those measures were not evidence of paranoia. They were evidence of a community doing what communities do. They learn, improvise, and try to prevent the recurrence of the previous disaster through collective knowledge. In the months that followed the unsolved disappearance, the story of Uncle Kimmick took on the weight of local folklore. It was told at co-ops, in the warm glow of kitchens, where people stitched new quilts and mended old ones. The younger generation listened with the kind of attention that kept lessons alive without turning them into ghost stories designed to thrill outsiders. The missing dogs were a wound that never closed. People still murmured about that lightning bank on certain nights, double meanings lodged in the mention of it, and the community took small precautions that were practical responses to an event that had no tidy ending. Those 3 nights, the theatre night, the cloud episode, and the long polar night, exist for me now as a kind of triptych. Each panel is different in its artistry, but the frame that holds them is the same, an environment so large and indifferent that small human dramas become magnified. The film reels pointed to human darkness that hid in plain sight, or at least filmed itself in the wrong places. The cloud pulled at the seams of physical expectation and reminded me how little we sometimes control when we are suspended between layers of atmosphere. The disappearance in Point Hope revealed how dangerous a place can be when a single absence pulls on a whole town's sense of security. There are patterns that matter. Isolation is not itself malevolent. It is a condition that amplifies consequences. A wound that would be shallow near a city hospital can be mortal in the bush, where rescue takes longer and weather complicates everything. A strange film that no investigator can date may remain inscrutable because there are no witnesses left who remember its context. An engine that dies in a cloud can mean the difference between an inconvenience and a life sentence of what-ifs. A man who disappears in the dark of northern night might be claimed by any number of plausible causes, and the most plausible ones do not always offer closure. I tell these stories not to propose an answer, or to indulge in fear, but to honor the way the edges of human life are shaped by place. There are forces we understand, and ones we do not. There are people who do unreasonable things, and people who do kind ones. Isolation compresses both tendencies. The work of a small-town trooper, a volunteer, a bush mechanic, a projectionist, a pilot. These are the thin, resilient threads that hold communities together against the things that would unravel them. I want to be clear about what we know and what we do not. The reels are authentic physical artifacts that were found and turned over to authorities. They remain disturbing and unexplained. The airplane's malfunction was a near miss that followed no neat mechanical diagnosis in that moment. It entered the archive of pilot folklore the way other anomalous flights do and left us with more questions than answers. Uncle Kimmick's disappearance is a wound that reshaped a community. The evidence gathered in the field did not point to a single conclusive cause, and the missing dogs remain unaccounted for. Troopers, volunteers, and mechanics did what they could. In each case, geography, time, and the limits of physical evidence held the line against definitive resolution. There is a humility here that keeps me from proclamations. I do not offer theories as if they were verdicts. There are, however, patterns worth noting. The way human cruelty can be recorded and then buried by time. The way atmospheric quirks can introduce danger that feels for a time inexplicable. The way a community's memory and ritual respond to absence with practical adjustments that are sometimes the only protection left. These are not mysteries to be solved by internet sleuthing or reckless curiosity. They belong to people who live there, who grieve and adapt, who keep a kind of steady knowledge that outsiders cannot easily share. If there is a moral to these inventories of strangeness, it is a simple one. Humility before place. Alaska teaches stubborn lessons. It teaches you that your best tools are respect, preparation, and community. The reels taught me that images can be witnesses without being explanations. The flight taught me that machines are fallible in ways that sometimes look like miracle and sometimes like malfunction. The disappearance taught me that no amount of rational theory can replace the simple work of neighbors watching for neighbors. I try to leave room in my telling for those who were affected. I don't use their names lightly. I don't compose theories to thrill a listener. Sorrow and curiosity can live in the same person, and I carry both. If you feel a pull to investigate, to bend the mystery toward closure, I urge caution. These places are not sets for a story. People live there, and any search must respect life and law and the dignity of those who remain. If you have a story from the edges, an odd reel, a strange flight, a local disappearance, share it with respect. The channel has a way for listeners to submit experiences. We will vet anything that comes in, and we will pass on what is responsibly shareable to those who can act on it. I have learned that sometimes the best service you can offer a mystery is attention given the right way, patient, deferential, and directed at those who need help rather than at spectacle. If you've watched this far, you know these 3 stories are bound by more than geography. They are bound by a single lesson. In places where the dark is long and the distances are long, small things become consequential, and unknown things can remain unknown for a long time. Respect that. Help if you can. Ask hard questions, but be content with humility when answers are not forthcoming. If you want to keep walking with these kinds of stories, consider supporting the channel. There is a membership and a Patreon where you can get early access and bonus material, and we use any funds to help pay for archival work and responsible reporting. And if you have something you think we should know about, submit it through the link in the description. Please, with the names and contact details of anyone who can vouch for it, and with an understanding that not every submission will be publishable. These 3 stories, an unlabeled reel, a plane that faltered inside a cloud, and an elder who vanished under a peculiar sky, linger. They are not resolved, and they may never be. But they are real in the sense that they affected people, altered routines, and left a trace in the small institutions that keep remote life possible. Troopers who follow leads, volunteers who search in the cold, mechanics who listen to engines for signs of mood. That is how the edges of the world maintain themselves, by people who return again and again to the things they can do. So keep your eyes open, your inbox respectful, and your curiosity guided by care. The wild is not a storybook. It is a place where mysteries happen, where lives continue, and where the best we can do sometimes is witness and remember.